Welcome to ND Love Story, where love stories are told with raw emotions and captivating storytelling. If you enjoy heartfelt and mesmerizing love stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ND Love Story so you won't miss any episode. I never planned to fall in love with him, but life doesn't always follow the rules, does it? It started with a chance encounter, a brief moment in time, and before I knew it, I was tangled in a web of secrets and lies. David was everything I shouldn't want: older, married, a cop with a life I had no business being a part of. But when he looked at me, I felt something I couldn't ignore, a spark, a connection that neither of us could walk away from. Now, every moment we share is a risk, one that could change everything. But for better or worse, I'm already in too deep. It started with an accidental brush of hands, nothing more than a fleeting moment of contact, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I hadn't expected it to happen like this, here of all places. But when I first met David, I didn't know anything about his life, his marriage, or the fact that he was one of the most respected cops in town. All I saw was a man with a quiet strength, someone who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. His presence was magnetic, drawing me in even though I tried to resist. I had just finished a long shift at the cafe, a place known for its moody lighting and indie music, where locals gathered to unwind. As usual, the workday had been draining, and I was eager to get home. But when I walked in, I saw him, David, sitting alone in a corner booth. His police uniform looked out of place in this cozy little cafe. But somehow it only made him seem more captivating. His jawline was sharp, his dark hair slightly tousled, and his deep-set brown eyes were fixated on a book in front of him. He had noticed me walking in, so I took a moment to observe him from a distance. He looked older than me, but there was a timeless quality about him, like he had seen the world, understood it, and yet still carried a certain sadness in his gaze. I wasn't sure what drew me to him initially. It could have been the fact that he was so composed, so serious, or maybe it was the mystery that surrounded him. There was a magnetism in the way he held himself, a quiet confidence that made it impossible to look away. At first, I tried to ignore the way my heart was racing. I tried to convince myself that he was just another customer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this encounter was different. The longer I stood there, the more I felt drawn to him, like an invisible thread was pulling me closer. When I made my way to the counter to place my order, I tried to stay focused, but I felt his eyes follow me. It was subtle, but it sent a wave of heat to my cheeks. I couldn't help but feel self-conscious knowing he was watching me. My usual confidence seemed to evaporate in his presence. I made the coffee as quickly as I could, trying to avoid looking his way too often. But the tension between us was undeniable. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, and every time I glanced in his direction, our eyes met for a brief second before I quickly looked away. It was like a silent understanding, as if we both knew that there was something unspoken between us. Something that neither of us wanted to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. When I finally brought his drink over, I could feel the weight of the moment. It was just a simple coffee, but to me, it felt like the start of something much bigger. I set the cup down on the table, my hands shaking slightly. He looked up at me with a faint smile, the kind that hinted at something deeper. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and smooth, sending a shiver through me. "No problem," I replied, my voice sounding too loud in my own ears. I wanted to say more, ask him something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I turned to leave, but then his voice stopped me. "You're new here, right?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was an underlying curiosity in it. I nodded, feeling the heat of his gaze on me. "Yeah, just started last week." "Nice," he said, leaning back in his seat, his eyes never leaving mine. "I haven't seen you around before. I'm usually on the morning shift," I explained, "but I guess you don't come in during the day." He chuckled softly. "Not much of a morning person," he said, a playful glint in his eyes. "I'm usually working, but today was a rare day off." We stood there for a moment, locked in a silent understanding. I should have walked away, should have kept my distance, but something in his presence made it hard to do that. I was already beginning to feel a pull, something I knew I shouldn't feel. "So, you like coffee?" I asked, trying to make small talk to fill the silence. He smiled, and this time there was warmth in it. "I do," he said, taking a sip from his cup. "It's one of my few vices." I laughed nervously. "Mine too," I guess. There was a pause, and then he set his cup down, looking up at me with a more serious expression. Listen, I know this is a little forward, but would you like to grab a drink sometime? I mean, just to talk. Nothing serious. The invitation hung in the air between us, and I could feel the weight of it. I knew I should say no. That it was dangerous. He was older, married, and a cop. Everything that screamed, off limits. But despite all that, the desire to say yes was overwhelming. In a brief moment, I just stood there, caught between what I knew was right and what I wanted. Sure, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The smile that spread across his face made my heart race, and I immediately regretted it. But it was too late to take it back. I had agreed, and now there was no turning back. I couldn't get the image of David out of my head. The way he sat, the intensity of his gaze as he turned the pages of that book. Lost in his own world. It all haunted me. But I knew it was ridiculous. He was a cop, probably married, probably with a life completely different from mine. I was just a barista, young and naive, still figuring things out. There was no way someone like him would ever be interested in someone like me. The next day I went back to work, not expecting to see him again. But as luck would have it, there he was, sitting at the same booth. His eyes met mine as soon as I stepped in, and for a brief moment, I felt like time stood still. He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curl of his lips, but it was enough to make my heart race. Hey, he said, his voice low and warm. I didn't expect to see you again. I froze for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. Yeah, I work here. I guess I should have expected to see you again. David chuckled, and there was something so genuine about it that it disarmed me. What's your name? He asked. I hesitated, unsure of how much I should reveal. How much I should allow myself to get caught up in this. But I found myself saying, Alex, what about you? David, he replied, and I noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. I like the coffee here. Thought I'd give it another shot. Was he here for the coffee? Or was it something else? For the rest of my shift, I tried to avoid looking his way too often. But every time I did, our eyes would meet and I'd feel that same magnetic pull. Every glance sent a jolt of electricity through me. This was dangerous. I knew it. By the end of my shift, David was still there, reading his book, his drink untouched, but his attention was fully on me. As I gathered my things to leave, he stood up, his towering presence blocking the exit for a moment. You're leaving? He asked, his voice a little softer now, almost hesitant. Yeah, my shift's over, I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was pounding. For a second, he didn't say anything. His eyes studied me like he was trying to read me, like he wanted to know everything about me. Then, to my surprise, he stepped aside and held the door open for me. Let me walk you out, he said, his tone both gentle and commanding. I didn't know why, but I let him. We walked in silence for a moment, the evening air cool against my skin, and I couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to consume the space around us. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. I don't usually do this, David said, suddenly breaking the silence. I don't usually talk to people like this. I stopped walking, confused by his words. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, shaking his head. I'm married. I've got a lot of responsibilities. You know, but there's something about you. Something I can't shake. I felt a pang in my chest at his words. Married. That was not the part one wanted to hear. That was the line I had crossed into dangerous territory. He wasn't just an attractive, captivating man, he was already taken. I should go, I said, my voice tight, feeling the weight of the reality settling in. I didn't want to make things complicated. Didn't want to be the guy who falls for someone already off limits. But David stopped me, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. Wait, he said, his eyes intense. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. But I can't stop thinking about you. And I don't know what that means. His words left me breathless. It was so clear that he was conflicted, torn between his duties, his marriage, and whatever this strange pull was between us. And that made it even more dangerous. But I couldn't help the way I felt. Part of me wanted to walk away, to protect myself from the heartbreak I knew was coming. But another part of me wanted to see where this could go. Even if it was a mistake. We stood there for a long time, just looking at each other. Both of us caught in an invisible web of desire and uncertainty. Finally, I broke the silence. I don't want to make this harder than it already is, I whispered, but I can't stop thinking about you either. And just like that, the unspoken bond between us solidified, pulling us closer even though we both knew it was forbidden. We exchanged pleasantries, and I learned that David's full name was Officer David Collins. He was a local cop, one of the most respected in the precinct. But he didn't speak much about his job. He preferred to talk about anything but that: his love for books, the quiet moments he cherished at home, and his weekend getaways to the mountains. It was all so normal. Nothing hinted at the truth lurking beneath his surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he was letting on. But at the same time, I knew better than to ask. I wasn't supposed to be here, talking to him, sitting so close to him, sharing these intimate moments. There was a boundary between us. And no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, I knew it was there. He was married, at least that's what I had gathered from the way he mentioned my wife in passing. Though it was never with the kind of affection one might expect. It was as though he was merely stating a fact, one that didn't carry any weight. I told myself that this was my cue to back off, to stay away from the temptation. But of course I didn't. I found myself looking forward to our encounters more than I cared to admit. Every time I saw David, I couldn't help but feel drawn to him, his eyes, the way they lingered on mine just a little too long, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It all felt like a secret, a forbidden connection that neither of us should have been exploring. But we were, and I couldn't help myself. The tipping point came one late afternoon. I was closing up the cafe when I heard the familiar jingle of the door's bell. I turned to see David walking in, his uniform a stark contrast against the dim, golden light of the cafe. His presence was as commanding as ever. But there was something different about his energy tonight. He seemed unsettled, like he was carrying the weight of something heavy. I walked over to him, trying to act casual, but I could tell he wasn't in the mood for small talk. His brow furrowed as he sat down at the counter. "Everything okay?" I asked instinctively, leaning forward, wanting to comfort him but also not wanting to overstep. He sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm fine," he said, but there was an edge to his voice that made me doubt his words. "Just got a lot on my mind." I didn't press him. Instead, I grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the counter, giving him space, but my curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me to him. "I'm here if you want to talk," I offered softly, my voice barely above a whisper. David looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of gratitude and conflict. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's complicated." His words hung in the air between us, thick with unspoken meaning. I wanted to ask him what was complicated. Was it his marriage? Was it me? But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence settle. Both of us sitting there, each of us wrestling with the weight of the moment. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit something I had been fighting since the first time I met him. I was falling for him. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that I wasn't. I'd never felt so alive, so caught in the whirlwind of something I couldn't explain. My feelings for David were growing stronger with every conversation, every smile, and every fleeting moment we shared. It was impossible to ignore. I couldn't help it. He had this magnetic pull that made me feel like I was floating. Like the whole world outside of him didn't matter. But each time I saw him, I felt a surge of guilt. He was married. He had a life that didn't involve me. I wasn't even sure if he felt the same way. But then there were those small moments, his eyes lingering on mine a bit longer than necessary. The way he leaned in when he spoke. The subtle brush of his hand against mine when he handed me his payment. Those touches, those unspoken words were all I needed to convince myself that there was something more. But was it enough? I tried to ignore it, to focus on the job, to keep my head down. But David's presence was a constant distraction, and I found myself planning my shifts around the days I knew he'd come in. Each encounter was like a stolen moment in a love story I wasn't supposed to be a part of. One afternoon, I was clearing a table when I noticed David walking toward me. My heart skipped a beat as he stopped just in front of me. His expression unreadable. "I have to talk to you," he said, his voice lower than usual. My stomach dropped. I glanced around nervously, trying to make sure no one was listening. "About what?" His gaze softened, and he stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his body near mine. "It's not easy to talk about," he began, "but I can't keep pretending like nothing is happening between us. The way we keep running into each other. It's not a coincidence." I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "David, we shouldn't." "I know," he interrupted, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. But I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong, and I know I'm married. But, he trailed off, his eyes searching mine for understanding. I felt a lump form in my throat. Part of me wanted to pull away, to remind him that this was wrong. But another part, one that I couldn't ignore, wanted to give in, to see where this dangerous path might lead. David, you can't, I started. But my words faltered as his gaze intensified. I'm not asking you to do anything you're not comfortable with, he said, his voice almost a whisper. But I need to know if you feel the same way. Because I don't know how much longer I can pretend that this, he gestured between us, is nothing. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about attraction anymore, it was about something deeper. Something that could destroy both of us if we weren't careful. I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know what to say. David, you don't have to say anything, he replied softly, taking another step closer. I just need you to know that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. His words hung in the air between us. And for a moment, the world around us seemed to disappear. All that mattered was him and me, standing in this small cafe, surrounded by the faint sound of clinking cups and soft chatter. But this was no ordinary moment, it was a moment that would change everything. But could I really go down this road with him? Could I be the other man? I didn't have an answer, not yet. But one thing was clear. The boundaries I had set for myself were slowly slipping away. And there was no turning back. The tension between David and I had reached its peak. Every time we were together, the air felt electric, charged with the weight of our unspoken desires. It was like walking a razor-thin line, one step away from falling into something I couldn't control. That night, after our usual exchanges of pleasantries and laughter, he lingered a little longer. His fingers brushed against mine again. A touch so light but somehow so heavy with meaning. His gaze locked with mine, and I could see the struggle behind his eyes, the conflict that mirrored my own. He was married, he had a family. Yet here he was, standing in front of me, like he was fighting something deep within himself. Can I talk to you for a moment? His voice was low, hesitant. I nodded, my pulse quickening. Of course. We walked to the back of the restaurant, away from the prying eyes of the customers. As soon as we were out of earshot, he turned to face me, his expression a mix of frustration and something else. Something vulnerable. I can't keep doing this, he said quietly, his hand running through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him do when he was deep in thought. This, whatever this is between us, I don't know what it is, but it's messing with my head. My heart raced in my chest. I wanted to reach out to him, to pull him closer, but I hesitated. David, I don't know what you mean. He let out a frustrated sigh. You know exactly what I mean. Alex, I'm married. I love my wife. But every time I see you, I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you. This is wrong. I know it's wrong, but I can't help myself. The confession hit me like a ton of bricks. I hadn't realized how much I wanted to hear him say it out loud. How much I needed to know he was feeling the same way I was. But hearing it also made the reality of the situation hit home harder. He was trapped in his own life, caught between what he wanted and what he had to maintain. I don't know what to do, he admitted, looking down at the floor. I've never felt like this before. Not with anyone, but I can't just walk away from my marriage. It's complicated. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside me. David, you don't have to decide right now. Just know that I'm here. I don't want to make things harder for you. He looked up, his eyes filled with conflict. I don't want to hurt you, Alex, but I don't know if I can stay away from you anymore. My heart skipped a beat as his words hung in the air, thick with promise and pain. I didn't know what this meant for us, or if it was something that could even work. But in that moment, as we stood in the quiet back hallway of the restaurant, I realized that whatever it was, it had already taken root inside of me. And no matter how wrong it might be, I couldn't just turn it off. I don't want you to stay away from me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. David stepped closer, his breath warm against my cheek. But what about your life? You don't deserve to be caught up in this. I don't care, I replied, my hand instinctively reaching for his. I just want to be with you. His eyes softened, and for a moment I saw the man he truly was. A man torn between duty and desire. Caught between a life he'd built and a love he couldn't deny. Without another word, he pulled me into a kiss. It was slow at first, hesitant, but then it deepened. It was everything I had ever wanted. But it was also terrifying. It was like a dream. A beautiful, impossible dream. But I knew that dreams like this didn't always end well. When we finally pulled away, breathless and shaken, David rested his forehead against mine. I don't know what this means, Alex, he whispered, his voice strained. But I know one thing. I can't stay away from you. I don't want to. The next few days were a blur. David hadn't reached out, and I had started to convince myself that maybe it was for the best. Maybe I needed to get over him and stop putting myself in a situation where I could get hurt. But even as I tried to move on, his absence left an ache inside me I couldn't shake. I missed the sound of his voice, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me. It was the following Thursday when he came in again. His eyes immediately found mine as he entered. And for the first time in days, I felt that same magnetic pull. That familiar rush of emotion. But this time there was something different in his gaze. There was an intensity, a determination I hadn't seen before. I walked over to his table, my heart hammering in my chest. But this time, I wasn't going to hold back. Whatever this was between us, I needed to know. I couldn't live in the shadows of my own confusion anymore. David, I said softly, trying to steady my nerves. We need to talk. He nodded, his jaw tight, but there was something else in his expression. Something I hadn't seen before. He was nervous, too, maybe even scared. He looked up at me, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About what's happening between us. His words hung heavy in the air. And I'm not going to lie. I'm just as confused as you are. I felt my heart race. And I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something. That I'm not drawn to you. He admitted, his voice shaking just a little. I've tried to ignore it, to bury it, but every time I see you, it feels like everything else disappears. He reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. His touch was warm, comforting, and I allowed myself to lean into it, to feel the weight of the moment. The truth between us. I love my wife, he continued, his voice filled with regret. But what I feel for you is something I can't explain. And I'm not asking you to wait for me, to be patient. David, I interrupted softly, my voice trembling with emotion. I don't need you to explain everything right now. I just need you to be honest with me. And if you're willing to try to figure out what this is, then I'll be here. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. You're willing to take that risk? I nodded, my heart swelling with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Yes, and in that moment, everything shifted. I wasn't just some guy he was having a fleeting affair with. I wasn't just a distraction or a secret. We were two people who had found something real. Something worth fighting for, even if it meant navigating the complexities of his life. David's lips brushed against mine, soft and slow, and I knew in that instant that whatever happened, whatever obstacles we'd face, we would figure it out together. Our love was far from perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. David and I knew what we had was forbidden, yet undeniable. Despite the weight of the world on our shoulders, we chose to face it together. As I looked into his eyes, I realized that love doesn't always follow the rules. But when it's real, it's worth fighting for. If you've ever been caught between desire and duty, share your thoughts below. What would you do in this situation? Let's talk about it. Comment, like, and don't forget to subscribe for more of these intense, heart-wrenching stories.